Natasha,
Debbie,
show.
the show.
Welcome to it. Just two patriotic girls.
Learning about the world.
So please, don't take us the wrong way.
Hi, welcome to the Natasha and Debbie show. You sit back there to show off your shirt?
Yes!
I figured.
I've had this forever, but still. It's Queen. Can't see it.
Yeah, you gotta
up
show it
here.
off.
When I come up here, you can't see it that well.
I know. That's the problem with these. Trying to show off your shirt, you can't show it off.
Well, we can see yours from space.
You sure can. It's nice and bright. Hello. I'm neon pink with a nice wide collar.
She's been making fun of her shirt, and I'm like, why did you buy this shirt?
I don't know. I thought it would look good. Didn't look so good.
It doesn't look bad.
It's not horrible, but it's not my favorite.
Hit the like button if you like Debbie's shirt, and if you like my shirt.
And hit the like button if you like Natasha's shirt.
I said that part. And if you like us, and if you like videos, and also consider subscribing to the channel because it's free. And we really kind of want you to be part of this insanely weird family where we talk about our clothes.
That's right. We're on our road to 100,000 subscribers, and we want you to be a part of it.
So today's episode is one that sounds very interesting. Popped up, and I'm like, huh, I didn't know you couldn't. What's it called, Debs?
It is called Why You Can't Measure the Coastline of Britain.
You can't, huh?
Hmm.
Why can't
Seems
you?
like you could.
I don't see why you couldn't. It's a coastline. You have a thing to measure it with, right?
I think it's a matter of how do you measure it?
I mean, but it says you can't. So I don't know what this means. I've never heard this in my life. I have no idea what's going to happen here. You ever heard anything about this?
I haven't, but I have often wondered how do you measure a coastline since...
Well, see, you get a bunch of guys. What happens here?
Well, I mean, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. I mean,
Oh,
how
no,
do
no.
you measure it?
No, you just get a bunch of dudes and you just line them all up. And you're like, make sure that you're touching shoulders with the next guy, right? And
Anybody
you go...
put your fingertips out?
No, it's shoulder to shoulder.
Shoulder to shoulder.
Shoulder to shoulder. And then you go, hey, you know, make sure you're shoulder to shoulder with your buddies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you just count up how many dudes are standing there. And you're like,
measure everybody's shoulders?
8,000 men. That's how big it is.
But are they standing in the water, on the edge of the water,
On the coastline.
a foot into the water?
What?
And like I said, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. How do you measure it? We're going to find out, hopefully, in this video.
Oh.
How and why you can't do any of these measurements.
We're going to start doing that right now. We're going to check out why you can't measure the coastline of Britain.
How long is the coastline of the United States? You might think the answer to that question is as simple as typing it into Google and seeing what comes up or measuring it all out yourself.
It's not?
But it's actually a very strangely complicated question that might be impossible for anyone to really answer no. When you type the question into Google, you'll end up with 3 completely different answers from 3 separate trustworthy sources.
Okay.
The Congressional Research Institute cites that the length is 29,093 miles, while the CIA cites a different number
CIA.
at 19,924
Don't
miles.
trust them.
While the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, cites a way higher number at 95,471 miles.
What's happening?
And the discrepancy between all 3 of these different organizations' answers isn't unique to just the coastline of the United States. Consider the following question. Which country has the longest coastline in the world? Most sources will agree that the answer to that is Canada, which
Yeah, I've heard
might
that.
not be too surprising because
Okay.
Canada is a geographically huge country and the second largest in the world, where its sheer length of coastline can be clearly seen on a map. But according to the CIA's World Factbook, the answer for the country with the world's second longest coastline is a lot more interesting and
Norway.
less expected. Norway.
Yeah, we know
It's
that.
potentially unexpected because Norway isn't really a huge country, and at first glance, it doesn't really look like Norway's coastline is particularly long either. But the thing
True.
about Norway is that the closer and closer you zoom in on the Norwegian coast, the more complicated it
Yeah.
appears to become. The
All the
coast is
fjords.
dominated by jagged fjords that zigzag around in every direction, and then there's all this seemingly endless amount of islands to consider as well.
Right.
It turns out that Norway actually has the second highest number of islands of any country in the world. There's more than 239,000 of them. In fact, the top 3 countries in the world by number of islands were all pretty surprising for me to find out, because they're all just next to each other right here in Scandinavia. Sweden, Norway, and Finland.
Isn't that funny how we're just doing
I
these
know.
videos and this just happens to be here? And we see, you start learning about places, you start putting it all together. It's a puzzle.
It is. It all
Comes
starts
together.
coming together, and you're like, uh-huh.
But that's a fascinating number. Good Lord.
Definitely.
3 countries alone possess more than 685,000
Ooh.
different islands between them,
Wow.
which
That's
is
cool.
rather astonishing because that's more than 3 times all of the other islands everywhere else in the world
Gee.
combined. It's just that most of the Scandinavian islands are all really, really tiny and
Right.
uninhabited.
True.
Like, just look at all these little islands around the coast
wow.
just outside of Stockholm. It'd take you days to count all of these up. So, when measuring the coastlines of each of these countries, the lengths of all these hundreds of thousands of islands must be individually calculated and added to the sum of the country's mainland coastline.
Okay.
That's a
And
lot.
since Norway's mainland coastline is also super jagged pretty much everywhere, and there's hundreds of
Damn.
thousands of islands, it's not that hard to understand how the CIA came to the conclusion that Norway's is the second longest coastline in the world. Their final calculation came out to 51,748 miles for the total length of the Norwegian coast, which is more than 2.5 times the length of the entire United States coastline that they also came up with.
Yeah, it
But
doesn't make
also
sense.
only about half the length of the United States coastline that NOAA came up with separately.
Yeah, interesting.
Essentially, everybody you ask how long a certain coastline is will always give you a different answer. And this phenomenon is known as the coastline paradox.
Okay,
It's
now
also-
I know I've heard that before.
Yeah, we have heard about that. We haven't actually looked into it.
No,
but
I
I didn't realize that the 3 agencies looking at it
at the
had
US
such
too.
vastly different numbers.
No, and they are ridiculously
I
different.
mean, come on.
Well, and they're all wrong probably. So don't know why, but let's get into this more. This is a fascinating video.
So rather easy to see how this can end up happening when you try and measure the coast of a country yourself. Let's take the United Kingdom as a rather straightforward example.
Okay.
The UK is an irregular shape with many different islands, bays, and peninsulas. And no matter
Easier than
how
US?
close you continue to zoom in on a place like the west coast of Scotland, the coastline only gets more and more detailed
Oh,
down to
wow.
the point where you reach the beach itself and the individual grains of sand that make it up. The hardest part about measuring
Oh.
any country's coastline is therefore deciding where to even start. And if you want to be completely accurate with your final number, you're gonna have to closely analyze every single piece of the coastline with something like an electron microscope. And even then, it still might not even be enough.
Just don't have
Since
the
that would
CIA do
probably
it.
take an infinite amount of time. It's far more straightforward to simply estimate the total length of the coast instead. And the easiest way to do that is by taking a map and placing many equally sized segments or rulers around the country's perimeter, and
Okay.
then adding up the lengths of those segments.
There you go.
So let's use a ruler that's 200 kilometers long.
I
We
can't
place
do
several of these
kilometers.
200-kilometer long rulers around the coast of Britain until we surround the island with 12 of them, which, when added all together, equals an estimated length of 2,400 kilometers. All right, but then let's replace the size of our rulers with one that's only half the size at 100 kilometers long.
Okay.
We do the same thing with these smaller rulers and now find that it takes us 28 of them to surround the coast, which when added up gives us a new total estimated length of 2,800 kilometers. 400 more than we had during the initial measurement.
Right.
And then if we have the size of the ruler again to 50 kilometers, it'll take us 68 of them to surround the coast, and adding them all up gives us another estimated length of 3,400
Yeah, I saw that coming.
kilometers,
Yeah.
which is now 600 kilometers longer than we had during the initial measurement
So now
when
do
we
a
were using a
25
larger
kilometer
ruler
ruler.
that was 4 times longer. This is the coastline paradox in action. Each
Okay, I
time
get
you
it
use
now.
a smaller ruler to measure the length of the country's coastline, the answer becomes increasingly larger to the point where eventually you could be using ruler sizes down to the atomic level, and the answer would begin approaching infinity. And this
So then you just
True.
use the guys, like I said. No, I'm kidding. Okay, this is much more. I don't know. I never really thought about it before. That's why I love doing this show. Like, there's so many things we've learned that I never would have thought about.
Absolutely. It makes sense. The closer zoomed in you get and the
Yeah.
smaller measuring tool that you use, the more accurate it's going to be, the higher the number's going to be.
Is it accurate? More accurate, though?
Well, if you're using the same measurement to measure them all, then it would be more accurate.
No. I find this fascinating. Like I said, just never would have thought to even. It's cool.
This means that the more complex an area's coastline is, the more open its length and span is to personal interpretation, which has had fascinating implications on global geopolitics throughout the ages. One of the greatest historic examples of this mathematical principle causing diplomatic headaches before it was well understood was back during the late 19th century dispute between the United States and the United Kingdom on where the border between them across Alaska and Canada should actually be set.
Okay.
You see, everybody back then had a different idea on where this border in what is today the Alaskan Panhandle should actually be placed. The United States insisted that it was here, while Canada and the UK government insisted it was here, while the British Columbia government further insisted that it was actually here.
Okay.
And much of the differing claims here stemmed from the different ways that every party was measuring the coastline. 40 years before the Americans purchased Alaska, the territory had belonged to the Russians.
We know.
And they signed an agreement with the UK that partially defined the border here with a highly ambiguous phrase that read, "a line parallel to the winding of the coast." Of course, the coast in the Alaskan Panhandle region looks pretty much just like the coast of western Norway, and it's covered in jagged fjords and scattered islands. Meaning that the extent of how much the coast winds is sort of open to your own interpretation in the way you measure it, which ultimately—
Yeah, I do feel stupid. I feel stupid. I just never thought of it this way. But I also don't because I just never thought of it. If I had thought about it, I would have realized, yes, this is complicated. So there, I've said it.
Well, like you said, it's not something we're near, we're used to.
It's just not.
So
nobody's come up to me, Debbie, on the street and said,
something that we thought about.
No one's come to me on the street and said, "Hey, Natasha, do you know the length of the coastline in this country and this country?"
Nobody has.
Now I'm going to make sure they know that I don't know, that I know, that I should know, that I don't know. Do you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
You go.
ultimately meant that the border could also be pretty open to interpretation. When
Just
measuring
weird.
out the border that was parallel to the winding of the coast,
Yeah, what's that mean?
everybody involved used a different way to measure how much the coast winded that happened to benefit their own geopolitical claims.
Very
and
true.
thus everybody came up with wildly different claims on where the border should actually be placed.
I can understand.
After Alaska's border was firmly set by arbitration in 1903, and after the territory became a state half a century later in 1959, it easily became the US state with the longest coastline by most measurements, and that's not really a surprise.
No.
Because Alaska is by far the
Huge.
biggest state in the country by area. But of course, the issue of how to accurately measure Alaska's jagged coastline and many islands has remained a problem in cartography through to the present day. Using two totally different methods, the Congressional Research Service published a report for the US Congress that measured the Alaskan coastline at
What's the CIA measured
10,960
as?
kilometers, while NOAA measured it separately at nearly 5 times longer than that
Jeez.
at 54,563
CIA?
kilometers, which does seem a little
Tell us.
absurd because that's longer than the entire circumference of the Earth.
Yeah.
Regardless of how they came to these wildly different conclusions, both the CRS and NOAA agree that Alaska has the longest coastline of the US states.
Well, yeah,
and they
okay.
each agree that Florida has the second longest coastline. But fascinatingly, they both disagree significantly from then on for the rest of the states' order
What?
because of their different yet still equally valid methods of measurement.
California?
The CRS believes that California and Hawaii possess the third and fourth longest coastlines of the states, which kind of makes sense because California has a long coastline
Hawaii
and Hawaii
is
is a
fourth?
bunch of islands.
True.
But NOAA conversely insists that the order after Florida is actually Louisiana and Maine for the third and fourth longest coastlines.
Really?
Which seems odd because when looking at a big map, the
Right.
Louisiana and Maine coasts each appear
Right.
much smaller than California.
Right.
But when you zoom in much closer to the California coast and scroll across it, you'll notice how smooth of a curve it is, almost
True.
continuously from the south to the north. Conversely, when you zoom in more closely on either the Louisiana or Maine coasts, you can
Complex.
quickly see how insanely jagged and fragmented both
Right.
of them are pretty much everywhere. And when using smaller units of measurement, like I assume NOAA was using, it's not that hard to see how they came up with the Louisiana coast being more than twice as long as the California coast.
Now I see that, yeah.
And how when using longer units of measurements,
Smaller
like I
measurement.
assume the CRS used, they came up with the opposite result
weird.
that California's coast is roughly twice as long as Louisiana's. The fascinating thing, though,
Well, hold on, but the fascinating thing though. Fascinating thing to me is why not use? I mean, who decides what to use? Like what type
What
of
measurement
measurement?
to use?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's why there should be a standard way
A
to
universal
measure
measurement.
it. Universal.
That's what I'm thinking.
standard.
Should there be? What do you think? Let us know. Do you agree? Universal measurement or Like, let's have 5 different ideas on something.
Yeah, I mean, you can't use 2 different
I don't-
measurements
I
and come
mean,
up with the same answer.
it's
That's
just perplexing to me.
should be universal.
Perplexing.
It is perplexing.
California's coast is roughly twice as long as Louisiana's. The fascinating thing, though, is that both of those answers are technically true, and it's simply just up to your own perspective and opinion on whether or not California or Louisiana have the longer coastline.
I don't know.
Saying one is longer than the other is not a definitive fact and is purely subjective.
I agree.
This concept
True.
of the coastline paradox was first noticed and written about more than 70 years ago in 1951 by a cartographer named Lewis Richardson. He had been studying whether or not the length of borders between countries had any effect on their likelihood to go to war. And during his research, he noticed a peculiarity between the border of Spain and Portugal. This is the longest uninterrupted border in the modern European Union, and it is the second oldest border anywhere in the world, having been continuously fixed in place for well over 700 years now, ever since 1297. There has been a very long time for each side of that border to understand its length, and
Okay.
nonetheless, Richardson noticed that the Portuguese and Spanish maintained different official lengths for it. The Portuguese felt it was 1,214 kilometers long, while the Spanish felt it was shorter at just 987 kilometers. This was, of course, simply because the Spanish were using a longer ruler to measure the border than the Portuguese were using, an effect that was later dubbed the Richardson effect.
Okay.
The sum of the segments used to measure a curved line, like a border or a coastline, is inversely proportional to the common length of those segments.
Aha.
In other words, meaning the shorter the segments used to measure, the longer the measurement of the curved line becomes, and the closer you
Yes.
get to the curved line's true length. Now, this method of measuring mostly works fine for smooth curves like the coast of California or the coast of Africa, but it starts breaking down when you attempt to measure jagged coastlines like
Louisiana,
Norway,
yeah.
Scotland,
That's true.
Look or Louisiana.
Scotland's coast
The
looks
closer you
impossible.
look at these kinds of coasts, the more rough edges are revealed.
Alaska, too.
So when you use smaller and smaller rulers, the length of the coast doesn't ever converge toward any fixed answer that everyone can agree upon. It
Understood.
just keeps getting longer and longer as you approach infinity, and so an answer has to be given before you get to that point. This concept was even better explained a decade later in the 1960s by the works of the brilliant mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who developed the concept of fractals in geometry. In his 1967 paper titled How Long is the Coast of Britain?, Mandelbrot explains the concept of fractals applied to measuring the coast of Britain. One of the main properties in geometric fractals is their self-similarity, meaning that no matter how closely you continue to focus on them, the same general shape continues to appear throughout. Jagged coastlines in particular, like the west coast of Scotland, essentially act like fractals because no matter how closely you magnify the view on them, a similar pattern of jagged edges appear right down to the very grains of sand and atoms beyond. And down at that atomic level, the coastline is always shifting around because of erosion caused by constant wind and tidal forces,
There you go.
which theoretically could mean that your measurement of the coast could become infinitely long and is thus undefined without an exact, satisfying answer.
So, but they keep mentioning Scotland, but they're not talking about the rest of the UK. Is it?
I think it's just because
I get why.
Yeah.
I get that, but I'm just saying, like, can they give a semi-answer that makes sense
more
to
definite.
the rest of? And
Sure.
is it Scotland that's causing the complication? I mean, it seems that way, obviously, looking at it,
It
you know,
does.
like when you look at Alaska, you know, you see all the little bits and pieces,
Yeah.
right? But,
Yeah, with their coastline just being a little bit more complex up there.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
interesting.
Infinitely long and is thus undefined without an exact, satisfying answer. In these kinds of environments, the best any of us can really ever do is simply estimate the length of the coast. As Mandelbrot
Okay.
asserted in his paper when he wrote, coastline length turns out to be an elusive notion that slips between the fingers of those who want to grasp it. Therefore, any measurement of any coastline you ever see going forward is not exact, and will always be an estimation based on the biases and methods used by the person or
True.
organization that
Didn't
did the
know.
measuring.
Didn't know.
Always take them with a grain of salt and skepticism.
Well, now I understand what the coastline paradox means.
Yes, we definitely know more about that. And it is interesting.
I'm going to plug, while you're talking, I'm going to plug in what Google says the coastline of Britain is real quick.
It is very interesting. You know, I never thought about how to measure a coastline, let alone
Right.
the coastline of Britain. And especially with all the little islands there and all the inlets and everything. It's really fascinating question that just never thought of. So I'm glad you are here to learn with us.
Well, you probably already knew this. I'm thinking you guys did.
You might have. And,
I didn't know.
It's just a fascinating question.
Yeah, and I'm not getting a direct answer even on Google. He's not wrong. I mean, I just again never. Wait, what does that one say? It says the coastline length around maintained Great Britain is 11,072.76 miles, which is 17,800 plus kilometers. And then there's a whole different. What? There's a whole different. Yeah, everything's different.
Yeah.
Again, odd.
So obviously, I mean, it does come down to what measurement you're using.
Yeah.
And it's going to change.
Yeah. I mean, I get it now.
I'm just really surprised that no one has come up with like an agreed upon way to measure it. And it's not like a universal thing.
That's true. Yeah, I agree. That's kind of surprising to me. There's a photo here I just want to pull up real quick, and it's showing, it's basically what he showed in the video. The difference with the 100-mile ruler versus the 50-mile ruler and how that changes the coast. Then there's a question mark that says 11,023 miles. The question mark at the end. So interesting. But yeah, if you guys like this episode, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel. This is going to have me in questions with you for a while. I think we're going to talk about this for a bit.
Yeah, I'll be perplexed and thinking about this on my own.
Well, I'm going to talk to your nephew about this.
Oh.
Her nephew, Nathan. Oh, we should have had him do this video with us. Oh, that'd have been great because he's very, 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 very smart. But I think he would have had an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, I don't know. This is a lot. Math has never been my strong suit ever. I would much rather be talking about books and things like that, poetry and other types of history. So this type of stuff kind of goes over my head a lot of the times. It's just not my forte. But it is interesting to know that there is no answer. That's my favorite type of maths.
Or any question. There's no answer.
It's subjective. I could have used that in school.
Exactly.
Teacher calls on you. What's the answer? It's subjective. It's maths. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching. We always enjoy you enjoying us. Help me, Debbie.
Another one of those questions. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Until then, guys, please love like jazz.
And be as strong as Tyson.
Bye-bye.
Bye.